Hello, and welcome to Boring History for Sleep, the podcast that helps you drift off to dreamland while learning about the fascinating figures and events of yesteryear. I'm your host, and I'm so glad you've chosen to spend part of your day or night with me. Before we dive in, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Are you tucked into bed, ready to doze off to tales of medieval monarchs? Or perhaps you're just looking to unwind after a long day with some calming historical storytelling. Either way, I'm honoured to be part of your relaxation routine. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. And if you enjoy this kind of soft-spoken, educational content, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Tonight, we'll be journeying back to the Middle Ages, a time of great change, conflict, and more than a few controversial kings. These royal rascals pushed the boundaries of their power, shocked their subjects, and left scandalous legacies that endure to this day. Some were known for their cruelty, others for their debauchery. But one thing they all had in common was a talent for stirring up trouble. As we explore the lives and reigns of these notorious nobles, we'll paint a vivid picture of what it was like to live in medieval Europe. It was an era of great piety and superstition, when the Catholic Church held immense sway over every aspect of society. At the same time, it was a period of political upheaval, as feudal kingdoms jockeyed for power and kings clashed with the Pope himself. In this turbulent landscape, some monarchs managed to stand out for all the wrong reasons. They challenged religious authorities, brutalized their enemies, and indulged their basest desires, all while claiming a divine right to rule. Their audacity was matched only by the outrage they provoked. So get comfortable, dear listener, and let us transport you back to a time when royals ran amok and history was made by the boldest and baddest of kings. We'll meet a monarch rumoured to have romantic inclinations his subjects found shocking, one who dared to imprison and execute a powerful order of knights, and another who just might be responsible for one of the most famous legal documents of all time. As we uncover each king's story, try to imagine yourself in their world. Picture the grand banquet halls where they feasted, the bloody battlefields where they fought, and the dark, dank dungeons where they locked up their foes. The Middle Ages may seem like a distant, dusty chapter in history, but these royal tales are as juicy and dramatic as any modern scandal. So dim the lights, settle in, and let the soothing sounds of centuries past lull you into a relaxed state. We've got quite a cast of characters to meet on our journey through the annals of medieval misdeeds. And who knows, you just might learn a thing or two before you drift off to sleep. Let's begin with a king whose personal life was the subject of much salacious speculation. William II of England, better known as William Rufus. Born around 1056 AD, William was the third son of William the Conqueror, the Norman king who invaded and subdued England. As a younger son, William wasn't expected to inherit the throne, but fate had other plans. In 1087, William's father died, leaving the crown to his eldest son, Robert Curthose. But Robert was off fighting in the First Crusade, so William saw his chance to seize power. He rushed to England and was crowned king in Westminster Abbey, with the support of influential nobles who preferred him to Robert. From the start of his reign, William Rufus cut a controversial figure. He was known for his fiery temper, his love of luxury, and his disregard for the church. But what really set tongues wagging were the rumours about his personal life. You see, dear listener, medieval England was a deeply religious society, one that took a dim view of any deviation from traditional masculine norms. And William, it seemed, was a bit of a free spirit in that regard. There were whispers that he surrounded himself with fashionable young men, showering them with gifts and attention. Some even claimed his relationships with these favourites went beyond mere friendship. Of course, we can't say for certain whether these rumours were true. Medieval gossip could be just as unreliable as the modern tabloid press. But for a king to face such speculation was deeply scandalous at the time. William's perceived predilections became a favorite topic of his enemies, who saw them as proof of his moral unfitness to rule. As if that weren't enough to cement William's bad boy reputation, he also had a habit of quarreling with the church. The most famous example came in 1093, when he clashed with Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury. The trouble started when William fell ill and, fearing he was on his deathbed, agreed to fill some vacant church positions, including the Archbishopric of Canterbury. He nominated Anselm, a respected scholar and abbot, for the top job. But William didn't die after all, and soon regretted his decision. He had a change of heart and tried to reverse Anselm's appointment, even offering him money to turn it down. Anselm, a man of principle, refused. The two men's relationship only worsened from there. William blocked Anselm from holding church councils and seized some of the archbishopric's revenues. Anselm, for his part, refused to condone William's attempts to assert royal authority over the church. The feud dragged on for years, a very public example of William's willingness to defy religious leaders. All of these controversies might have been forgotten by history if not for the shocking circumstances of William's death. In the year 1100, William was hunting in the New Forest when he was struck by an arrow and killed. The shot was fired by a nobleman named Walter Tyrrell, who just happened to be the brother of the man who had recently succeeded Anselm as Archbishop of Canterbury. Coincidence? Many at the time thought not. Rumours swirled that Tyrrell had assassinated the king on the orders of the church, in retaliation for William's disrespect. Others whispered that William's own brother Henry, who was also hunting in the forest that day, was behind the killing. We may never know the truth of what happened on that fateful hunt. What we do know is that William Rufus left behind a legacy as one of medieval England's most polarizing kings, a man whose personal and political scandals made him a subject of fascination and condemnation in equal measure. As we continue our tour through the lives of controversial medieval monarchs, we turn next to a king whose conflicts with religious authority took an even more dramatic turn: Philip IV of France. Born in 1268, Philip came to the throne at the age of 17, inheriting a kingdom that was one of the most powerful in Europe. But he would soon put that power to use in ways that shocked and horrified his contemporaries. Philip's most notorious act was his brutal suppression of the Knights Templar, a wealthy and influential order of warrior monks. The Templars had been founded in the 12th century to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. Over time, they had grown into a major financial and military force, with a network of strongholds and banks stretching across Europe. But in 1307, Philip suddenly turned on the Templars, ordering the arrest of their leaders on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and sexual misconduct. The knights were subjected to horrific torture, including having their feet roasted over flames until the bones fell out. Many confessed to the charges under duress, only to recant later. Philip didn't stop there. He pressured Pope Clement V to dissolve the Templar order entirely, seizing its assets for the French crown. The Templars' Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake in 1314, proclaiming his innocence to the end. Historians still debate Philip's motives for this shocking purge. Some believe he was driven by a genuine belief that the Templars were guilty of heresy. Others argue that he was more interested in getting his hands on their vast wealth and eliminating a potential rival to his power. Whatever the reason, the suppression of the Templars was just one example of Philip's willingness to defy religious authorities. He also clashed repeatedly with Pope Boniface VIII, who tried to assert the Church's supremacy over secular rulers. In 1301, Boniface issued a papal bull declaring that kings were subject to the authority of the Pope. Philip wasn't having it. He responded by calling an assembly of French nobles and clergy, who issued a declaration affirming the independence of the French crown. The conflict escalated from there, with Philip's officials even physically assaulting Boniface at one point. The crisis reached its climax in 1303, when Boniface prepared to excommunicate Philip, a severe punishment that would have cut the king off from the sacraments of the church. But before he could deliver the sentence, Boniface suddenly died. Many suspected foul play, and rumours circulated that Philip had ordered the Pope's murder. Whether or not that was true, there was no denying that Philip had won a major victory over the church, cementing his authority as an absolute monarch. But Philip wasn't content to target just religious institutions. He also turned his ire on another vulnerable group, France's Jewish population. In 1306, he abruptly expelled all Jews from the kingdom, seizing their property and assets for the crown. The expulsion devastated Jewish communities that had lived in France for centuries. Many were forced to flee with little more than the clothes on their backs, seeking refuge in neighbouring lands. The crackdown also dealt a blow to the French economy, as Jews had played a significant role in banking and trade. Like the suppression of the Templars, the expulsion of France's Jews showed the ruthless lengths to which Philip was willing to go to consolidate his power and wealth. It was a chilling reminder of the precarious position of minorities in medieval society, subject to the whims of monarchs who claimed to rule by divine right. As we've seen, dear listener, Philip IV was a king who left a trail of shock and outrage in his wake. His reign marked a crucial turning point in the balance of power between the monarchy and the church, one that would have profound consequences for centuries to come. But if you think Philip's behaviour was extreme, just wait until you hear about our next royal rogue, Pedro I of Castile, better known to history as Pedro the Cruel. Born in 1334, Pedro was the king of Castile and Leon, one of the most powerful kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula. From an early age, Pedro developed a reputation for violence and impulsivity. As a young prince, he was known to lash out at anyone who displeased him, once even stabbing a nobleman to death for failing to show him proper respect. But it was as king that Pedro's cruelty truly reached new heights. One of his first acts after taking the throne was to murder his illegitimate half-brother, Fadrique, whom he suspected of plotting against him. Pedro invited Fadrique to a banquet, then had him seized and executed on the spot. Pedro's brutality wasn't limited to his own family. He also had a habit of turning on his allies and advisors, executing them at the slightest hint of disloyalty. One contemporary chronicler claimed that Pedro kept a special mace by his bed, which he used to bash in the skulls of anyone who displeased him. But Pedro's most notorious act of cruelty was his treatment of his wife, Blanche of Bourbon. The marriage was a political one, arranged to cement an alliance between Castile and France. But Pedro had no love for Blanche, and soon abandoned her in favour of his mistress, Maria de Padilla. When Blanche complained about her mistreatment, Pedro had her imprisoned and eventually put to death. The exact circumstances of her demise are unclear, but some accounts suggest that Pedro ordered her to be poisoned. Pedro's scandalous personal life and ruthless rule made him plenty of enemies. In 1366, his half-brother Henry of Trastamara launched a rebellion against him with the backing of the French crown. The ensuing civil war dragged on for years, with Pedro at one point seeking the help of England's Black Prince to shore up his position. In the end, though, Henry emerged victorious. He defeated Pedro in battle and had him captured and killed, according to legend, stabbing his half-brother to death with his own hand. It was a fitting end for a king whose life had been marked by violence and betrayal. As shocking as Pedro's reign was, it wasn't the last time that a Castilian king's personal life would cause a scandal. Fast forward a couple of centuries to the reign of Henry IV, who ruled from 1454 to 1474. Henry's most notorious scandal involved his marriage to Joan of Portugal. After several years of marriage, Joan gave birth to a daughter, also named Joan. But rumours swirled that the child was not actually Henry's, but rather the product of an affair between Joan and one of Henry's favourites, Beltrán de la Cueva. The rumours gained so much traction that Joan became known as Juana la Beltraneja, literally, Joan the daughter of Beltran. The scandal cast doubt on the legitimacy of Henry's heir and contributed to a period of political instability in Castile. In the end, Henry's reign ended in turmoil, with his half-sister Isabella and her husband Ferdinand of Aragon seizing power after his death. The couple would go on to unite Castile and Aragon into the Kingdom of Spain, ushering in a new era of Iberian history. But the legacy of controversial kings like Pedro and Henry would linger long after their deaths. Their shocking deeds and tumultuous personal lives became the stuff of legend. Cautionary tales about the dangers of unchecked power. Speaking of unchecked power, our next king is a prime example of what can happen when a monarch's ego and ambition run amok. Eric XIV of Sweden, who ruled from 1560 to 1568, was a man of great intellect and cultural sophistication. He spoke several languages, composed music, and fancied himself a Renaissance prince. But Eric's reign was also marked by paranoia, delusions, and erratic behavior. Early on, he became convinced that his half-brother John was plotting to overthrow him. Eric had John imprisoned and even threatened to have him executed, though he eventually backed down. As his reign went on, Eric's mental state seemed to deteriorate further. He became obsessed with the idea of marrying Queen Elizabeth I of England, sending her lavish gifts and love letters. When Elizabeth politely declined his advances, Eric flew into a rage, accusing her of leading him on. Eric's courtship of Elizabeth was just one example of his grandiose ambitions. He also dreamed of conquering the Baltic region and establishing Sweden as a major European power. But his military campaigns were largely unsuccessful, and his erratic behavior began to alienate his own nobles. In 1567, Eric's paranoia reached a fever pitch. He became convinced that a group of nobles, led by the Stura family, were conspiring against him. In a fit of madness, he had several members of the family arrested and executed in an event known as the Stura murders. The killings shocked and horrified the Swedish nobility, who saw them as a gross abuse of power. Eric's own brother John, whom he had once imprisoned, now led a rebellion against him. In 1568, Eric was dethroned and imprisoned himself. Eric spent the rest of his life in captivity, moved from castle to castle by his brother and successor, John III. In 1577, he died in prison, possibly poisoned on John's orders. It was a sad and ignominious end for a man who had once dreamed of being a great Renaissance king. As we've seen, dear listener, the life of Eric XIV is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and ambition. His story also highlights the precarious nature of kingship in an era when mental illness was little understood and often seen as a sign of divine disfavor. But Eric was far from the only medieval monarch to grapple with questions of legitimacy and succession. In fact, some of the most controversial kings in history were those who found themselves in disputes over their right to rule. One such king was John, also known as John Lackland, who ruled England from 1999 to 1216. John was the youngest son of King Henry II and had not been expected to inherit the throne. But when his elder brother Richard the Lionheart died without an heir, John claimed the crown for himself. John's reign was plagued by conflicts with his own nobles, who resented his attempts to centralize power and raise taxes. In 1215, a group of barons rebelled against John and forced him to sign the Magna Carta, a document that limited the powers of the monarchy and established the principle of the rule of law. But John had no intention of abiding by the Magna Carta's terms. He appealed to Pope Innocent III to annul the document, arguing that it had been signed under duress. When the barons learned of John's betrayal, they invited Prince Louis of France to invade England and claim the throne for himself. The ensuing war was a disaster for John. He lost a treasure trove of royal jewels and gold while crossing a treacherous stretch of marshland, and soon after fell ill with dysentery. In 1216, he died a miserable and ignominious death, his kingdom in ruins. John's reign was so disastrous that he became known as Bad King John in popular legend. But his legacy is more complex than that simple epithet suggests. The Magna Carta, though initially a failure, would go on to become a cornerstone of English law and a symbol of individual. As we've seen, the reigns of Henry VIII and his contemporaries were marked by religious upheaval, political intrigue, and plenty of personal scandal. But they were far from the only controversial kings to sit on the thrones of medieval Europe. Take, for instance, the notorious Charles II of Navarre, known to history as Charles the Bad. Born in 1332, Charles was a man of great ambition and few scruples. As King of Navarre and Count of Evreux, he spent much of his reign embroiled in conspiracies and power struggles with his nominal overlord, King John II of France. Charles first ran afoul of the French crown in 1354, when he was accused of plotting to assassinate the Dauphin, the future King Charles V. Though the evidence was scant, he was imprisoned by King John. But Charles was nothing if not cunning. He soon escaped and fled to his lands in Navarre, where he raised an army and declared war on France. Over the next few decades, Charles proved himself a thorn in the side of the French monarchy. He allied himself with England during the 100 Years' War, and later murdered a prominent French nobleman, Count Charles of Spain. His scandalous deeds earned him the nickname Charles the Bad and made him powerful enemies on both sides of the Channel. But perhaps Charles's most audacious plot was his scheme to claim the French throne itself. In 1378, he announced that he was the rightful king of France by virtue of his descent from King Louis X. It was a bold claim, and one that found little support among the French nobility. But it showcased Charles's naked ambition and disregard for political norms. Charles's adventurism eventually proved his undoing. In 1387, after decades of on and off conflict with France, he was forced to surrender most of his French lands to King Charles VI. Though he remained King of Navarre, his power was much diminished. He died just 6 years later, his grand designs largely unfulfilled. Charles the Bad's turbulent reign showcases the web of rivalries and alliances that defined medieval politics. In an age when royal authority was often tenuous, ambitious nobles like Charles could carve out their own fiefdoms and challenge even the mightiest of kings. But if Charles represented the height of feudal power politics, other controversial kings took their cues from the ruthless dynasts of the ancient world. One such figure was Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, better known to history as Vlad the Impaler. Born in 1431 in present-day Romania, Vlad was the second son of Vlad II, Tranquil, a member of the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order dedicated to defending Christian Europe from the Ottoman Turks. As a young nobleman, Vlad and his brother were sent to the Ottoman court as political hostages, a common practice at the time, designed to ensure the loyalty of vassal rulers. Vlad's years in Ottoman captivity had a profound impact on his psyche and his ruling style. He developed a deep hatred for the Turks and a reputation for brutality that would follow him all his life. When Vlad finally claimed the Wallachian throne in 1456, he wasted no time in consolidating his power. He invited his political rivals to a great feast at his castle, then had them all arrested and impaled on stakes. This grisly display was just a taste of the terror to come. Over the next few years, Vlad earned his macabre nickname through a campaign of cruelty that shocked even his contemporaries. He impaled thousands of his own subjects for crimes as petty as stealing a loaf of bread. He also unleashed a reign of terror against the Transylvanian Saxons, a German-speaking minority whom he saw as a threat to his power. But Vlad reserved his greatest brutality for his old enemies, the Ottoman Turks. In 1462, he launched a daring raid into Ottoman territory, burning villages and slaughtering peasants with gleeful abandon. When the Sultan Mehmed II sent envoys to negotiate a truce, Vlad had them impaled on the spot. Vlad's defiance of the Ottomans made him a hero to many in Europe, who saw him as a Christian bulwark against the Islamic tide. But his cruelty and paranoia eventually alienated even his closest allies. In 1462, he was deposed by his own brother Radu, who had been raised alongside him as an Ottoman hostage. Though he later regained his throne, his power was broken. Vlad himself was killed in battle in 1476 or 1477, his body allegedly decapitated by the Turks. Today, Vlad the Impaler is remembered more as a figure of Gothic horror than as a real historical personage. His deeds were so shocking, so seemingly inhuman, that it's tempting to relegate him to the realm of nightmares and dark fantasies. But the true history of this controversial king is even more disturbing than the legend. Vlad's reign of terror may have been extreme, but it was far from unique in the bloody annals of medieval kingship. Across Europe, monarchs and nobles alike engaged in acts of cruelty and vengeance that seem scarcely believable to modern minds. In England, for instance, there was the notorious King John, whose misrule and capricious violence led to a baronial revolt and the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. Though often remembered today as a champion of liberty, John was in fact a ruthless tyrant who thought nothing of murdering his own nephew or starving his opponents to death in his dungeons. Then there was the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a brilliant but amoral ruler who clashed repeatedly with the papacy and was accused of heresy, blasphemy, and even Satanism by his enemies. Frederick was a man of insatiable curiosity and cruel whims, who once had a group of children raised in isolation to see what language they would speak, the so-called language deprivation experiment. He was also rumoured to have kept a harem of concubines and dabbled in the occult arts, charges that only added to his sinister reputation. But perhaps no medieval monarch embodied the dangerous allure of power quite like the legendary Empress Theodora of the Byzantine Empire. Born into poverty and disgrace, her father was a bearkeeper at the Hippodrome, and she herself worked as an actress and courtesan in her youth. Theodora rose to become the most powerful woman in the medieval world. As the wife of Emperor Justinian I, Theodora wielded enormous influence over the Byzantine state. She helped to crush the Nika riots that nearly toppled her husband's regime, and later convinced him to stand firm in the face of a devastating plague and foreign invasions. Her bravery and ruthlessness earned her the admiration of her subjects, but also the enmity of the Byzantine elite, who resented her humble origins and her unfeminine assertiveness. Theodora's most controversial act, however, was her active involvement in religious affairs. A devout monophysite Christian, who believed that Christ had only one divine nature, rather than a human and divine nature as taught by Orthodox doctrine, she used her influence to promote monophysite clerics and to persecute their Orthodox rivals. This put her at odds with the Pope and much of the Western Church, a conflict that would have far-reaching consequences for the unity of Christendom. Despite her many enemies, Theodora remained a force to be reckoned with until her death in 548 AD. She was mourned by the common people of Constantinople, who saw her as a protector and champion. But she was reviled by the senatorial class, who spread scurrilous rumours about her sexual depravity and cruelty. Like so many controversial rulers of the Middle Ages, Theodora's legacy is a complex one. She was a woman who defied the conventions of her time and wielded power in a world that was hostile to female authority. But she was also a ruthless and sometimes tyrannical figure who used her influence to crush her enemies and impose her will on the state. In the end, perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of medieval kingship, that power, for all its seductive allure, is a dangerous and corrupting force. The kings and queens who wielded it most effectively were often those who were willing to embrace its darker aspects, the cruelty, the paranoia, the megalomania. Today, we may look back on these controversial rulers with a mixture of fascination and horror, but in their own time, they were simply the product of a world where might made right, and where the strong ruled over the weak with an iron fist. As we've seen, the Middle Ages were a time of great upheaval and transformation, a period when the old order was crumbling and new powers were rising to take its place. In this chaotic and often brutal world, kings and queens wielded enormous influence over the lives of their subjects. Some used that power for good, while others used it for ill. But all of them left an indelible mark on history. The stories of these controversial rulers may seem like the stuff of legend, tales of larger-than-life figures who strode across the world stage, leaving chaos and bloodshed in their wake. But the truth is often stranger than fiction. These men and women were real people, with real flaws and real passions. They were the product of their times, shaped by the beliefs and values of the society in which they lived. And yet, for all their faults and foibles, these kings and queens also had a profound impact on the course of human events. They helped to shape the political, social, and religious landscape of medieval Europe, a legacy that endures to this day. As we look back on their lives and deeds, it's easy to pass judgment from the comfort of our modern vantage point. But to truly understand these controversial rulers, we must try to see the world through their eyes, to grasp the challenges they faced, the beliefs they held, and the choices they made. Only then can we begin to appreciate the complexity and the contradictions of medieval kingship, and to grapple with the enduring questions that these remarkable men and women left behind. The stories we've explored in this series are just a small sampling of the many controversial kings and queens who left their mark on the Middle Ages. From the ruthless dynasts of the early feudal era to the absolutist monarchs of the late medieval period, these rulers embodied both the best and the worst of human nature. Some, like Charlemagne or Alfred the Great, are remembered as wise and just leaders who brought order and stability to their kingdoms. Others, like Vlad the Impaler or King John, are reviled as tyrants and monsters who unleashed untold suffering on their subjects. But whether they were beloved or despised, these monarchs all shared one thing in common: the awesome power and responsibility of kingship. In an age when the divine right of kings was taken for granted, and when the fate of nations hung on the whims of a single ruler, the decisions made by these men and women had far-reaching consequences. Their reigns were marked by war and peace, by famine and plenty, by piety and sin. They built great cathedrals and castles, patronized the arts and sciences, and left a lasting imprint on the culture and society of their times. And yet, for all their grandeur and glory, these kings and queens were also deeply human, prone to the same fears, desires, and weaknesses as the rest of us. They loved and hated, triumphed and failed, lived and died. In the end, they were simply men and women who bore the heavy burden of leadership in a turbulent and often unforgiving age. As we reflect on their lives and legacies, we are reminded of the timeless lessons of power and politics, of ambition and hubris, of courage and cruelty. These are the themes that echo down through the ages, from the halls of medieval palaces to the corridors of modern power. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us ponder the stories of these controversial kings and queens, not just as dusty relics of a bygone era, but as enduring reminders of the human condition. For in their triumphs and their tragedies, their virtues and their vices, we may just catch a glimpse of ourselves. We left off with the shocking execution of Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, on trumped-up charges of adultery and treason in 1536. The tyrannical king would waste little time moving on from this dark chapter. Mere days after Anne's head had left her shoulders on the executioner's block, Henry was engaged to the demure and obedient Jane Seymour. In many ways, Jane was the antithesis to Anne Boleyn. Where Anne had been fiery, bold, and opinionated, Jane was passive, gentle, and pliable. She was what Henry wanted in a wife at this point, a docile partner who would provide him a male heir without argument or protest. 11 days after Anne's execution, while the court still reeled, Henry and Jane were wed in a private ceremony. Henry's subjects may have been aghast at the dizzying speed of events, but they also desperately hoped this unassuming new queen could succeed where her predecessors had failed, in giving birth to a healthy prince. England had seen enough turmoil and uncertainty in the succession. To Henry's delight, Jane soon fell pregnant and gave birth to a son, Edward, in October 1537. At long last, he had achieved his primary aim. Tragically, Jane would not have long to savour her triumph. She fell gravely ill with childbed fever soon after Edward's birth and died just 2 weeks later. Henry was utterly bereft at the loss of his most beloved queen. In a reign defined by marital strife and notoriety, his union with Jane would be remembered as his happiest. He would eventually be buried beside her, as per his wish, a rare gesture of esteem and affection from the oft-wed king. With Jane's death, the problem of succession reared its head once again. Henry still had only one male heir, and in an age of high infant mortality, this was a tenuous position indeed. After a period of mourning, the king began seeking a new bride, intent on reinforcing the Tudor dynasty. Numerous candidates were considered, with Henry even contemplating marrying his own daughter Mary at one point, a match as scandalous as it was unlikely. In the end, Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, devised a plan to wed the king to Anne of Cleves, a German noblewoman. Cromwell hoped the match would strengthen England's ties with Protestant Europe amidst ongoing religious strife. A portrait was dispatched to Henry, who deemed himself satisfied with Anne's comely looks. But upon meeting her in person for the first time, the king was repulsed, declaring her a Flanders mare. The feeling was mutual. Anne found Henry old, corpulent, and foul-smelling. Nevertheless, the marriage went ahead in January 1540, though it was never consummated. Revolted by his new bride, Henry could scarcely stand to be in the same room with her. The morning after the wedding, he raged to Cromwell that he had plainly been misled about Anne's appearance. In a matter of months, the marriage was annulled on grounds of non-consummation, and Anne's pre-existing betrothal to another European nobleman. The amicable Anne accepted the judgment and a generous settlement. She lived out her days in England in comfort as the king's sister. For Cromwell, the ill-fated Cleves marriage spelled disaster. He had pushed for the union and was now blamed for its failure. Cromwell's many enemies at court had been waiting for just such an opportunity to turn the king against him. Led by the Duke of Norfolk, they convinced Henry that his once trusty minister was a traitor. Cromwell was arrested and condemned to death without trial, his dizzying downfall a reminder of the capriciousness of Henry's favour. No sooner was Cromwell in his grave than Henry wed for the 5th time, marrying the vivacious teenager Catherine Howard. Norfolk's niece was a flirtatious beauty who restored the king's lust for life despite being 30 years his junior. But history would soon repeat itself in shocking fashion. Whispers reached Henry of Catherine's colourful sexual past and possible infidelity. An investigation uncovered tawdry details of affairs with at least 2 men predating her marriage, as well as allegations of adultery with a courtier. For the aging Henry, it was a crushing blow. Enamoured with his girl bride, he had indulged her every whim and shown off her youthful charms, only to be made a fool of by her scandalous conduct. The punishment would be every bit as brutal as that meted out to Anne Boleyn. After a trial in which her own relatives provided damning evidence, Catherine was beheaded for high treason in February 1542, along with several alleged paramours. The Howard debacle marked a turning point for the king. His health in serious decline and having grown morbidly obese, Henry withdrew from public life. Perhaps chastened by this humiliation, he made a far more sensible choice for his sixth wife, marrying the mature widow Catherine Parr in 1543. More nurse than spouse, Parr would be spared the cruel fates of her predecessors, providing Henry companionship in his final years. Throughout this tumultuous period, the king had not neglected his obsession with securing the succession. The misfortunes that had befallen Henry's wives stood as stark reminders of the fragility of the Tudor dynasty. With characteristic ruthlessness, the king moved to shore up his line, executing any and all perceived threats. Most notably, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury and daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, was brutally put to death in 1541 on trumped-up charges of treason at the age of 67. Her real crime was being one of the few remaining Plantagenets with a blood claim to the throne. The manner of her execution was especially vicious. When Margaret refused to lay her head upon the block, the inexperienced executioner hacked at her head and shoulders, taking 11 blows to strike the fatal hit. It was a gruesome end for a woman of noble birth, and a sign of Henry's growing paranoia and brutality. As the king's life drew to a close, the question on all lips was the fate of his sole male heir. Edward was still a child, inheriting the throne at the tender age of 9 upon Henry's death in January 1547. On his deathbed, the king had named a regency council dominated by Protestants to rule on Edward's behalf. But this did little to quell the vicious power struggle already brewing. Despite reigning for only 6 years, Edward VI would preside over a period of immense religious upheaval. Under the sway of radical Protestant advisors like Edward Seymour and John Dudley, he would accelerate the English Reformation begun by his father, moving the Church of England in an even more extreme direction. Catholic rites were banned, priests could marry, and even the act of hearing the Latin Mass was punishable by imprisonment. But like so many boy kings, Edward's reign would be cut tragically short. Always a sickly youth, he contracted tuberculosis and died at the age of 15 in 1553. On his deathbed, and under the influence of Dudley, he had attempted to block the Catholic Mary from the succession. But this plot unravelled, and Mary took her rightful place as England's first Queen Regnant. For a monarch later vilified as Bloody Mary, she began her reign on a conciliatory note, pardoning traitors and declaring her intent to rule by good counsel. But her promise to not compel her subjects to follow her Catholic faith would prove hollow. Mary soon embarked on a program of aggressive recatholicization, reversing the religious reforms of her father and brother. Under Mary, English Protestants faced a reign of terror. The persecution started with high-profile figures like Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had played such a key role in Henry's break with Rome. After a long imprisonment and forced recantations, Cranmer was burned at the stake in 1556, dramatically renouncing his recantations and denouncing the Pope as he faced the flames. Cranmer was just one of hundreds of Protestant martyrs executed during Mary's reign. The stories of their brutal deaths, many burned alive for heresy, would sear into the English imagination. But Mary's religious extremism won her few friends, with growing unrest and several attempted uprisings against her rule. Her legitimacy was further weakened by an unpopular marriage to Philip II of Spain, which prompted fears of foreign domination. In the end, Mary's turbulent reign would last a mere 5 years. Like her Tudor predecessors, Mary was haunted by the need to produce an heir, but her phantom pregnancies came to naught, and she died childless in 1558, paving the way for her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth to inherit the throne. The nearly 45-year reign of Elizabeth I would usher in a golden age for England after decades of turmoil. Keenly aware of the examples set by her father's matrimonial misadventures, Elizabeth would make the shocking choice to never wed at all, famously proclaiming, "I will have but one mistress here and no master." Her marital status birthed her image as the Virgin Queen, wedded only to her country. But Elizabeth's romantic life was a subject of endless scandal and speculation. Throughout her reign, she was linked to several favourites, most notably her sweet Robin, Robert Dudley. Rumours swirled that the lifelong bachelor was impotent, that he had murdered his first wife to be free to marry the Queen, and that he was even Elizabeth's secret lover or illegitimate half-brother. None of this could be proven, but the whispers persisted. As Queen, Elizabeth had to fend off countless marriage proposals from foreign princes and navigate the tricky waters of international diplomacy. She used the lure of matrimonial alliances as a key political tool while ultimately remaining single. Her failure to marry was a source of great concern, but she skillfully managed the succession issue, designating James VI of Scotland as her heir on her deathbed. Elizabeth's reign was marked by military triumphs like the defeat of the Spanish Armada, flourishing arts patronage, and relative stability after the tumult of previous decades. But it was not without its share of intrigue and unrest. The Queen faced numerous plots against her life, including from the Duke of Norfolk, the highest-ranking peer in England, who schemed to wed Mary, Queen of Scots, and place her on the English throne. The Catholic Mary had fled to England after being deposed in Scotland and was immediately imprisoned by Elizabeth. Seen as a threat because of her strong claim to the English crown, Mary would remain a captive for nearly 20 years. She became the focal point for Catholic conspiracies and ultimately entangled in the Babington plot to assassinate Elizabeth. Convicted of treason, she was beheaded on Elizabeth's orders in 1587 after much agonizing by the Queen. Mary's execution remains one of the most controversial and dramatic episodes of Elizabeth's rule. It carried eerie echoes of the vicious dynastic slaughter that had characterized her father's reign. But while Henry VIII had annihilated threats and upended the country for the sake of producing an heir, Elizabeth would defy this model, ruling England as a woman alone in a remarkable feat of political survival. In the end, the Tudor dynasty would not long outlive Elizabeth. After 118 years on the throne, the House of Tudor came to an end with her death in 1603. The crown passed peacefully to the Stuarts in the form of James I of England, the son of Elizabeth's old nemesis Mary, Queen of Scots. It was a twist of fate laden with irony, and a sign of just how far England had come since the bloody days of Henry VIII. As we reflect on the scandalous reigns of the Tudor monarchs, what lingers above all is a sense of the immense human drama behind the crown. The royal bed and birthing chamber formed the epicenter of political life, shaping the fates of queens and countries alike. For all their outward splendor, monarchs like Henry VIII were slaves to the most primal of drives: the need to secure the succession at any cost. The Tudor period also reminds us of the astonishing power of the individual to shape the course of history. Towering personalities like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I loom large over the era, their personal quirks and obsessions leaving indelible marks on everything from England's religion to its place on the international stage. At the same time, the period's queens consort stand as poignant reminders of the human collateral damage wrought by unchecked royal power. In death, as in life, the controversial Tudor monarchs retain their hold on our imaginations, inviting us to reflect on the enormous burdens and responsibilities of wearing a crown. As scandals swirled and heads quite literally rolled, England was dragged into the modern era, undergoing religious, political, and cultural revolutions that would reverberate through the centuries. Against all odds, the tawdry Tudor court birthed a new model of English kingship, and a legacy as captivating as it is shocking. As we've seen, the reigns of Pedro I of Castile, Eric XIV of Sweden, and John of England were marked by brutality, paranoia, and conflicts with nobility that would ultimately lead to their downfalls. But perhaps no medieval monarch left a more indelible mark on history than Henry VIII of England. Born the second son of Henry VII, young Henry was never expected to inherit the throne. But when his elder brother Arthur died suddenly at age 15, Henry became the heir apparent. He ascended to the throne in 1509 at age 17, quickly marrying his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. The early years of Henry's reign were marked by extravagance, as the young king enjoyed lavish banquets, grand tournaments, and ambitious foreign military campaigns. But it was Henry's desperate quest for a male heir that would come to define his legacy. After nearly 20 years of marriage, Catherine had failed to produce a surviving son, only a daughter, Mary. By 1527, Henry had become enamored with the young Anne Boleyn and sought an annulment from Catherine to marry her instead. When Pope Clement VII refused to grant the annulment, Henry took the shocking step of breaking with the Catholic Church altogether. In 1534, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, essentially appointing himself the Pope of his own church. This allowed him to finally annul his marriage to Catherine and wed Anne Boleyn. England was now a Protestant nation, and the Catholic monasteries were dissolved as their wealth poured into Henry's coffers. But Henry's marital strife was far from over. Just 3 years after their wedding, he had Anne Boleyn beheaded on likely trumped-up charges of adultery and treason. He would go on to marry 4 more times, executing another wife and overseeing England's zigzagging between Protestantism and Catholicism. His erratic religious policy saw both Protestants and Catholics burned at the stake for heresy. Henry VIII died in 1547, leaving the throne to his young son, Edward VI. Though he had finally produced the male heir he so desperately sought, Edward would die childless just 6 years later. The tumultuous saga of Henry's marriages and the royal succession would continue, as England ricocheted between Protestant and Catholic monarchs. In many ways, Henry VIII embodies the contradictions and controversies of so many medieval kings. He is remembered as a captivating yet capricious ruler, ushering in the English Renaissance while executing tens of thousands of dissenters. His break from Rome forever reshaped the religious landscape of Europe, but his true motivations seem to lie more in consolidating his own power and satisfying his lusts than theological convictions. As we reflect back on the scandalous lives and stranger-than-fiction stories of the most controversial kings of the Middle Ages, we see that Henry VIII was far from alone in his outrageous deeds. From the mysterious death of William II to the brutal purges of Pedro the Cruel, medieval chronicles are littered with accounts of corruption and abuse of power. These sordid tales can perhaps be seen as cautionary ones, warning of the dangers of unchecked authority. Kings like Philip IV of France and John of England learned the hard way that even divinely appointed monarchs were not immune from the wrath of nobles, clergy, and commoners they flagrantly oppressed. The Magna Carta and the defiance of the Knights Templar demonstrated that there were limits to the power of kings. At the same time, the willingness of medieval kings to shock and scandalize, to upend long-standing traditions and institutions, could be seen as a perverse sort of progress. Henry VIII's break from Rome, as selfishly motivated as it was, opened the door for a freer and more pluralistic England. In an era of conformity and superstition, there is something perversely admirable about the iconoclasm of rulers who refused to follow the rules, even as it led them to cruelty and ruin. As we drift off to sleep, lulled by these lurid tales of our ancestors, we are left to ponder what they reveal about human nature and the corrupting influence of power. The pageantry and brutality of the Middle Ages may seem remote to us now, but in the shocking deeds of these controversial kings, we see shadows of our own capacity for scandal and self-destruction. Perhaps there is a twisted king lying in wait within us all, just looking for a throne to ascend and a crown to abuse. And on that unsettling note, I bid you good night and sweet dreams of more civilized times. And so, as we've seen, the reign of Henry VIII was marked by tumult, scandal, and religious upheaval that would forever change the course of English history. His desperate quest for a male heir led him to break with the Catholic Church, establishing the Church of England with himself at the head. This seismic shift in religious authority would have profound consequences, setting the stage for centuries of conflict between Catholics and Protestants in England and beyond. But Henry's legacy extended far beyond the religious sphere. His 6 marriages, 2 of which ended with his wives' heads on the chopping block, have become the stuff of legend. The tale of Anne Boleyn, in particular, has captured the imagination of generations. A vivacious, ambitious woman who caught the eye of a king, only to be accused of adultery and incest when she failed to produce a male heir. Her tragic end, beheaded on the grounds of the Tower of London, serves as a chilling reminder of the precariousness of life in Henry's court. Indeed, Henry's reign was characterized by an almost casual brutality, a willingness to dispose of anyone who stood in the way of his desires. From the execution of his loyal advisor, Thomas More, who refused to acknowledge Henry as head of the church, to the ruthless suppression of the Pilgrimage of Grace, a popular uprising against his religious reforms, Henry demonstrated time and again that he would brook no opposition to his will. Yet despite his many flaws and transgressions, Henry VIII remains a towering figure in English history. His reign saw England emerge as a major player on the European stage, with Henry himself taking an active role in diplomacy and warfare. He presided over a flourishing of art and culture, patronizing such luminaries as the painter Hans Holbein and the composer Thomas Tallis. And of course, his enduring legacy can be seen in the very fabric of modern Britain, from the monarchy to the Church of England. As we reflect on the lives and legacies of these controversial medieval kings, it's hard not to be struck by the sheer scope and scale of their impact. From William the Conqueror to Henry VIII, these men shaped the course of history in ways that continue to reverberate to this day. Their reigns were marked by scandal, intrigue, and violence, but also by moments of great achievement and progress. Perhaps what is most remarkable about these kings is the way in which their stories continue to captivate us, centuries after their deaths. There is something endlessly fascinating about the medieval world, with its pageantry and its brutality, its piety and its debauchery. In the lives of these kings, we see reflected the full spectrum of human experience, from the highest highs to the lowest lows. And yet, for all their flaws and foibles, there is something almost romantic about these medieval monarchs. They lived in a time when the concept of divine right held sway, when kings were seen as God's anointed representatives on earth. This sense of destiny, of being born to rule, imbued their lives with a sense of grandeur and purpose, even as it sometimes led them down dark and dangerous paths. As we look back on the medieval era from the vantage point of the present day, it's easy to view these kings as something of a cautionary tale. Their reigns serve as a reminder of the corrupting influence of power, of the way in which even the most noble intentions can be twisted and perverted by the demands of the crown. And yet, at the same time, there is something undeniably compelling about their stories, about the way in which they struggled and strived to leave their mark on history. In the end, perhaps the most enduring legacy of these controversial kings is the way in which they continue to inspire and fascinate us long after their bones have turned to dust. Their lives and deeds have become the stuff of legend, woven into the fabric of our collective imagination. And as we drift off to sleep, our minds filled with tales of courtly intrigue and battlefield heroics, we can perhaps find some small measure of comfort in the knowledge that, for all their flaws and failures, these kings left an indelible mark on the world, one that will endure for generations to come. So let us bid farewell to the controversial kings of the medieval era, secure in the knowledge that their stories will live on, as enduring testament to the power and the peril of the crown. May their tales continue to inspire and enlighten us, even as they lull us into the gentle embrace of sleep. And may we awake in the morning with a newfound appreciation for the rich tapestry of history, and for the countless men and women who have shaped it through their deeds and their misdeeds, their triumphs and their tragedies. For in the end, it is the sum total of these stories that makes us who we are, that binds us together as a species and propels us ever forward into the uncertain but endlessly fascinating future that awaits us all. Soft, calm narrator voice. As we delve deeper into the scandalous lives of medieval monarchs, we cannot overlook the audacious antics of Philip IV of France, a king whose reign was marked by suppression, feuds, and downright ruthlessness. Philip, also known as Philip the Fair for his handsome appearance, ascended to the French throne in 1285 at the tender age of 17. But don't let his youthful good looks fool you. This king was as cunning and cutthroat as they come. Early in his reign, Philip set his sights on the legendary Knights Templar, a powerful military order that had amassed immense wealth and influence during the Crusades. Envious of their riches and suspicious of their secretive ways, Philip hatched a plan to take them down. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, Philip ordered the simultaneous arrest of all Templars in France. In a move that would make even the most ardent conspiracy theorist blush, he charged them with a litany of offences, including heresy, blasphemy, and homosexuality. The stunned knights were hauled off to face torture and trial, their vast treasure seized by the crown. After confessions were extracted under duress, scores of Templars were burned at the stake, including their Grand Master Jacques de Molay. As the flames consumed him, de Molay allegedly cursed Philip and Pope Clement V, who had conspired with the king to dismantle the order. But Philip's audacity didn't stop there. In an era where monarchs were expected to defer to the authority of the church, Philip dared to challenge the Pope himself. When Pope Boniface VIII asserted the supremacy of papal power, Philip retaliated by calling for a general church council to have the pontiff deposed. Boniface shot back with a papal bull threatening Philip with excommunication, but the defiant king had the bull ceremonially burned in Paris. The feud reached a shocking climax when a gang of Philip's henchmen attacked the 68-year-old Pope in his palace, allegedly striking him in the face. Although Boniface was released after 3 days, he died just a month later, leaving Philip to install a more compliant French pope and cement his authority over the church in France. As if that weren't enough, Philip also turned his ire on France's Jewish population. In 1306, he abruptly expelled all Jews from the kingdom, giving them mere months to flee and seizing their property and assets in the process. Thousands were forced to sell their belongings for a pittance before going into exile, while Philip lined his coffers with their wealth. Philip's heavy-handed approach extended to his own nobility as well. He ruthlessly suppressed uprisings and revolts, executing scores of knights and lords who dared defy his authority. He also imposed heavy taxes and debased the currency to finance his ambitious military campaigns, earning the ire of his overtaxed subjects. For all his strong-arm tactics, Philip was an undeniably effective ruler who strengthened the French monarchy and expanded royal power. He standardized weights and measures, reformed the legal system, and even banned private wars between nobles. His reorganization of the government and assertion of the supremacy of the state over all other institutions laid the foundations for France's rise as a major European power in the centuries to come. Yet Philip's legacy is forever tainted by the brutality and scandal that marked his reign. His suppression of the Templars, expulsion of the Jews, and clashes with the Pope shocked the conscience of medieval Europe and reverberated long after his death. In the end, Philip IV may have been called the Fair, but there was nothing fair or just about his treatment of his subjects and rivals alike. As we ponder this controversial king's misdeeds, it's hard not to wonder how he might have fared in our modern world of social media and 24-hour news cycles. One can only imagine the scandalous headlines and blistering hot takes that would have dogged Philip at every turn. But alas, we must leave such musings for another day as we allow ourselves to be lulled into slumber by the sordid tales of medieval monarchs gone mad with power. Good night, dear listener, and may your dreams be free of despotic kings and scheming popes. Transition to next segment. From one notorious ruler to another, we turn our attention now to a king whose cruelty was so legendary that it earned him a chilling epithet: Pedro, the Cruel of Castile. Glancing at the magnificent gold crown encrusted with glittering rubies and emeralds, John carefully placed it atop his head. The immense weight of this priceless symbol of power and authority was not lost on him in this moment. John, youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, had finally achieved his ultimate ambition, to be crowned King of England, but his grip on power would prove tenuous at best. You see, John had not been the original heir to the throne. That designation fell to his celebrated older brother Richard the Lionheart. While Richard was off leading the Third Crusade and later being held captive, John attempted to seize power. This earned him the mocking moniker John Lackland from his father, who had already parcelled out his lands to John's brothers. The nickname would prove to be darkly prophetic. After Richard's untimely death, John did finally secure his place on the throne in 1199, but he quickly made powerful enemies with his erratic, cruel, and tyrannical behaviour. John's reign would be characterised by a series of disasters, both political and military. A mere 5 years into his rule, John suffered a massive blow to his prestige when he lost Normandy and most of his other French lands to Philip II of France. This was a humiliating defeat for an English king who was also a vassal to the French king. Returning from France after his devastating losses, John attempted to rebuild his reputation by leading a campaign in Ireland. But his efforts gained little, and he returned to England once again in disgrace. John's next blunder would be his protracted quarrel with Pope Innocent III over who should be the new Archbishop of Canterbury. When John stubbornly refused to accept the Pope's appointee, the Pope took the extraordinary measure of excommunicating him and placing England under interdict. For several years, church services were not allowed to be performed in England, and the devout lived in fear for their immortal souls, until John was forced to make peace with the Pope and pay tribute. Throughout all of these calamities and more, John still found ample time to throw his weight around and alienate his subjects. He raised taxes to punishing levels, exploited his feudal rights for personal gain, and even allegedly took the wives and daughters of his barons for his own pleasure. The cruelty John exhibited in snuffing out any dissent was legendary. He had a penchant for imprisoning his enemies and leaving them to starve to death. One unfortunate baron by the name of William de Brieux ran afoul of King John and ended up imprisoned along with his wife and son. All three eventually succumbed to starvation in John's dungeons. Another example of John's wanton cruelty was the case of a hapless hostage by the name of Arthur of Brittany. Arthur had the grave misfortune of being John's nephew with a claim to the English throne. Seeing Arthur as a threat, John had him imprisoned and, according to some accounts, killed him with his own hands. With John's cruelty and misrule rousing the hatred of his subjects, the most powerful barons finally had enough. In 1215, they raised an army against John and forced him to sign the Magna Carta at Runnymede. This great charter would go on to be the foundation for the rights of English citizens and an important precursor to democratic rule. But John, never one to learn his lesson, didn't take this setback lying down. He wrote to the Pope complaining that the Magna Carta had been exacted under duress. The Pope agreed and annulled the document, plunging England into civil war. The barons offered the throne to Prince Louis of France, who promptly invaded. Fortunately for John, he was spared from yet another humiliating defeat, this time by his own death. According to one account, John had set out from the port town of King's Lynn with his army and began crossing the treacherous tidal marshes of the Wash. John's baggage train, which was said to include the crown jewels, didn't make it across the mudflats that day. As the tide came rushing in, the wagons, horses, and men were all caught in the churning current and dragged out to sea along with John's priceless treasure. Some say it was the loss of his jewels that broke John's heart and led to his death a few days later, while others whisper that he was done in by a surfeit of peaches, or even poisoned by a vengeful monk. Whatever the cause, John's ignominious end was a fitting one for a king who had brought so much misery to his subjects. He died reviled and unmourned, leaving a legacy of cruelty, treachery, and misrule. To this day, King John is remembered as one of the worst kings in English history. His name is synonymous with failed leadership and abuse of power. But perhaps John's greatest legacy is the Magna Carta itself, a document that has come to symbolize the idea that no one, not even a king, is above the law. So ends the sordid tale of King John, a man who snatched disgrace from the jaws of unimaginable privilege and power. But while John may have been one of the most controversial kings of the Middle Ages, he was by no means alone in his infamy. The medieval world was full of colourful monarchs, whose lives and deeds continue to fascinate us to this day. From the warring kings of England and France to the cutthroat dynastic struggles of Castile and Aragon, medieval monarchs were a breed apart. These men, for they were nearly all men, wielded absolute power and all too often used it for their own gain rather than the good of their subjects. They waged endless wars, murdered their rivals, and exploited their lands and people with impunity. But despite their many flaws and failings, there is still something undeniably compelling about these medieval rulers. Perhaps it is the sheer drama of their lives, the court intrigues, the battles, the romance and the betrayals. Or maybe it's the way they embodied the spirit of an age of faith and superstition, of chivalry and brutality, of soaring cathedrals and grim dungeons, an age when the line between greatness and infamy was so often blurred. Whatever the reason, the controversial kings of the Middle Ages continue to cast a long shadow over the popular imagination. Their stories serve as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the timeless human capacity for both greatness and depravity. And so, as we reflect on the tumultuous lives and scandalous deeds of these medieval monarchs, perhaps we can take some small comfort in the fact that, for all their flaws, they were still only human. They may have worn crowns and sat on thrones, but in the end, they were subject to the same fears, desires, and weaknesses as the rest of us. In that sense, the controversial kings of the Middle Ages are not just dusty figures from a bygone era, but a mirror held up to our own humanity. A reminder that power, for all its seductions, is ultimately a double-edged sword, and that even the mightiest among us are still only mortal in the end. So let us leave this exploration of medieval infamy with a renewed appreciation for the complexities of the human condition. And let the tales of these controversial kings be a gentle reminder, as we drift off to sleep, of the fleeting nature of power and the eternal struggle between light and darkness that lies at the heart of the human experience. As we've seen, the reigns of Henry VIII and John Lackland left indelible marks on English history, reshaping the very fabric of politics, religion, and society in ways that would reverberate for centuries to come. But they were far from the only medieval monarchs to leave a controversial legacy. Across the Channel in France, another king was making waves with his ruthless suppression of a powerful religious order and his insatiable greed. Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair due to his handsome appearance, cuts a striking figure in the annals of medieval history. On the surface, he appeared to be the very model of a chivalrous Christian king, pious, just, and commanding. But beneath that carefully cultivated image lay a shrewd and cunning ruler, one who would stop at nothing to consolidate his power and fill his coffers. Philip's reign was marked by a series of audacious power grabs that brought him into direct conflict with two of the most influential institutions of the medieval world, the Knights Templar and the papacy itself. The Knights Templar were a powerful military order that had grown immensely wealthy through their role as protectors of Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. But by the early 14th century, with the Crusades largely over and their original purpose gone, the Templars had become a thorn in Philip's side. Envious of their wealth and paranoid about their potential as a rival power, Philip resolved to destroy the Templars once and for all. In an audacious move, he ordered the arrest of all Templars in France on October 13th, 1307, a Friday the 13th that would go down in infamy. The Templars were subjected to brutal torture and coerced into making false confessions of heresy, blasphemy, and sexual depravity. Many were burned at the stake, their order disbanded, and their assets seized by the crown. But Philip's thirst for power and wealth was not yet sated. He soon found himself embroiled in a bitter feud with Pope Boniface VIII, who sought to assert the Church's authority over temporal rulers like Philip. In a shocking display of defiance, Philip had the elderly pontiff kidnapped and beaten, an act that left Boniface broken and humiliated. Though the Pope escaped and excommunicated Philip, he died shortly thereafter, leaving the French king to install a more pliant pope of his own choosing. Philip's heavy-handed treatment of the Church and his shameless looting of the Templars' wealth may have won him few friends, but it undoubtedly made him one of the most feared and formidable rulers of his age. His ruthless consolidation of power laid the groundwork for the rise of the French monarchy as a centralized, absolute authority, a legacy that would endure for centuries to come. But Philip was not content to merely crush his rivals and enrich himself at the expense of others. He was also responsible for one of the most shameful episodes in medieval French history, the expulsion of the Jews in 1306. Seeking to bolster his depleted treasury, Philip ordered the arrest of all Jews in his kingdom, seizing their property and assets and forcing them to leave the country under pain of death. It was a cruel and cynical move, one that uprooted entire communities and inflicted untold suffering on thousands of innocent people. But for Philip, it was simply another means to an end, a way to line his pockets and tighten his grip on power, no matter the human cost. As we reflect on the life and legacy of this most controversial of French kings, it's hard not to be struck by the sheer audacity of his actions. In an age when the Church reigned supreme and the power of kings was still constrained by feudal obligations, Philip IV stood out as a ruler who dared to challenge the established order and who almost always emerged victorious. But at what cost? The suppression of the Templars, the humiliation of the papacy, the expulsion of the Jews, these were not the acts of a just or benevolent ruler, but rather the desperate gambits of a man consumed by his own ambition and greed. In his quest for power and wealth, Philip IV left a trail of destruction and suffering in his wake, one that would cast a long shadow over the history of medieval France. As we continue our journey through the annals of controversial kings, we'll encounter more rulers like Philip, men who wielded their power with a ruthless and often reckless abandon, leaving behind a complicated and often troubling legacy. But perhaps none would match the sheer brutality and bloodshed of our next subject, a Castilian king whose cruelty knew no bounds, and whose very name would become synonymous with terror and tyranny. Pedro I of Castile, known to history as Pedro the Cruel, was a king who seemed to revel in violence and mayhem. Born in 1334, he came to the throne at the tender age of 16. But any hopes that his youth might temper his ruthless streak were quickly dashed. From the very beginning of his reign, Pedro showed himself to be a ruler with a sadistic streak, one who took pleasure in the suffering of others. One of the most notorious episodes of Pedro's reign came early on, when he ordered the execution of his own illegitimate half-brother, Alfonso. The young prince had been a potential rival for the throne, and Pedro wasted no time in eliminating the threat. In a grisly display of brutality, Alfonso was suffocated to death with a wet cloth, his lifeless body left to rot in a dungeon. But Pedro's cruelty was not reserved solely for his own family members. He was known to torture and execute his enemies with a sadistic glee, often in the most gruesome and painful ways imaginable. One of his favorite methods was to have his victims tied to a stake and shot with arrows, a slow and agonizing death that could take hours or even days. Pedro's reign was marked by constant warfare and conflict as he sought to expand his territory and crush any opposition to his rule. He found himself embroiled in a long and bitter struggle with his half-brother Henry of Trastamara, who sought to overthrow him and claim the throne for himself. In a twist of fate that seems almost too bizarre to be true, Pedro even managed to drag England into his conflicts. He allied himself with the English during the early stages of the 100 Years' War, hoping to use their support to bolster his own position. But the alliance was short-lived, and Pedro soon found himself facing off against the very forces he had once counted as allies. Despite his brutality and his many enemies, Pedro managed to cling to power for nearly 2 decades. But his luck finally ran out in 1369, when he was cornered and killed by his half-brother Henry in a dramatic showdown at the castle of Montiel. In a fitting end for a king known for his cruelty, Pedro was stabbed to death by his own brother. His reign of terror finally brought to an end. But even in death, Pedro's legacy would prove to be a controversial one. For some, he was a tyrant and a monster, a king whose cruelty knew no bounds and who left a trail of blood and destruction in his wake. But for others, he was a strong and decisive ruler, one who was willing to do whatever it took to maintain his grip on power and keep his enemies at bay. Regardless of how one chooses to view him, there can be no denying that Pedro I of Castile was one of the most controversial kings of the medieval era, a ruler whose brutality and savagery would echo through the ages, forever cementing his place in the annals of history's most notorious monarchs. As we move on to our next subject, we find ourselves in the far reaches of Northern Europe, in the Kingdom of Sweden. There, in the 16th century, another controversial king would make his mark on history, not through brutality and bloodshed, but through a reign marked by madness, paranoia, and delusions of grandeur. Eric XIV of Sweden was a king who seemed to have it all: good looks, intelligence, and a progressive mindset that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. But beneath the surface, Eric was a deeply troubled man, one whose grip on reality would slowly but surely unravel over the course of his reign. From the very beginning, there were signs that all was not well with the young king. He was prone to sudden fits of rage and paranoia, lashing out at those around him and seeing conspiracies and plots at every turn. He became increasingly erratic and unpredictable, his behavior growing more and more bizarre with each passing year. One of the most famous episodes of Eric's reign came in 1567, when he launched an ill-fated campaign to win the hand of Elizabeth I of England in marriage. Despite being rebuffed by the English Queen, Eric became convinced that she was secretly in love with him, and he grew increasingly obsessed with the idea of making her his bride. In a desperate attempt to win her favour, Eric began to shower Elizabeth with lavish gifts and love letters, pouring vast sums of money into the effort. He even went so far as to send a group of his most trusted advisors to England to plead his case in person, a move that backfired spectacularly when the delegation was promptly arrested and imprisoned by the English authorities. But Eric's delusions of grandeur were not limited to his romantic pursuits. He became increasingly convinced that he was a divine figure, chosen by God to rule over Sweden and the world beyond. He began to style himself as a prophet and a visionary, claiming to receive messages and visions from on high. As his behavior grew more and more erratic, those around Eric began to fear for his sanity and for the stability of the kingdom itself. In 1568, a group of nobles led by his own brother John staged a coup, forcing Eric to abdicate the throne and imprisoning him in a castle. For the next 9 years, Eric would languish in captivity, his once brilliant mind slowly unraveling in the darkness of his cell. He became convinced that he was being poisoned by his captors, and he began to suffer from hallucinations and delusions that grew more and more vivid with each passing day. In the end, Eric's fears of poisoning would prove to be all too prescient. In 1577, he died in his cell, likely from arsenic poisoning at the hands of his own brother. A fitting end for a king whose reign had been marked by madness and paranoia from the very beginning. As we reflect on the life and legacy of Eric XIV, it's hard not to be struck by the tragedy of his story. Here was a man who had everything going for him: intelligence, good looks, and a progressive mindset that could have made him one of the great rulers of his age. But instead, he was undone by his own inner demons, his brilliant mind slowly unraveling until there was nothing left but madness and despair. In the end, Eric XIV stands as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the fragility of the human mind and of the terrible toll that unchecked mental illness can take on even the most promising of individuals. His story is a tragedy in every sense of the word, a life cut short by forces beyond his control, and a legacy forever tainted by the spectre of madness and delusion. As we come to the end of our journey through the lives of some of medieval history's most controversial kings, it's hard not to be struck by the sheer complexity and contradictions of these fascinating figures. From the ruthless ambition of Philip IV to the sadistic cruelty of Pedro the Cruel, from the reckless defiance of John Lackland to the tragic madness of Eric XIV. These were men who left an indelible mark on their times, for better or for worse. In many ways, the stories of these kings serve as a reminder of the incredible power and influence that medieval monarchs wielded over their subjects, and of the often dire consequences that could result when that power was abused or misused. These were men who held the fate of entire nations in their hands, whose whims and desires could mean the difference between life and death for countless thousands of people. And yet, for all their power and influence, these kings were also deeply human, flawed, fallible, and often driven by the same desires and weaknesses that afflict us all. In their triumphs and their failures, their brilliance and their madness, they serve as a reminder of the incredible complexity of the human experience and of the enduring fascination that we hold for those who have shaped the course of history. As we look back on the lives of these controversial kings, it's important to remember that their stories are not just tales of individual triumph or tragedy, but rather part of a much larger tapestry, a complex web of political, social, and cultural forces that shaped the course of medieval Europe and beyond. In the end, these kings were as much products of their times as they were shapers of them, born into a world of incredible change and upheaval, and forced to navigate the treacherous currents of power and ambition that swirled around them. And so, as we bid farewell to the likes of William Rufus, John Lackland, Philip IV, Pedro the Cruel, Eric XIV, and Henry VIII, let us remember them not just as individual figures, but as part of a much larger story, a story of power and politics, of faith and betrayal, of love and loss, and everything in between. For in the end, it is through the lives of these kings, and the countless others who came before and after them, that we can begin to understand the rich and endlessly fascinating history of the medieval world in all its complexity and contradictions. As we drift off to sleep, let us carry with us a newfound appreciation for the incredible stories and personalities that have shaped our world, and a renewed sense of wonder at the enduring power of history to captivate, inspire, and transform us all. For in the end, it is through the study of the past that we can begin to make sense of the present, and to dream of a future that is brighter, bolder, and more beautiful than anything that has come before. As we've seen, the reign of John Lackland was marked by military losses, oppressive taxation, and tense conflicts with the nobility that ultimately led to the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. This groundbreaking document placed unprecedented limits on royal authority and laid the foundation for constitutional law in England. While the Magna Carta didn't immediately solve the issues of John's tumultuous rule, it planted the seeds of change that would gradually transform the relationship between the monarchy and the people. But John was far from the only English king to leave a controversial legacy. Nearly 300 years later, Henry VIII would shake the very foundations of English society, religion, and politics with his unprecedented split from the Catholic Church. Born in 1491, Henry was never supposed to be king. But when his older brother Arthur died unexpectedly, Henry suddenly found himself as the heir to the throne at just 10 years old. From a young age, Henry was known for his intelligence, charisma, and athletic prowess. He excelled at sports like jousting and tennis, and was also a talented musician and composer. When he ascended to the throne in 1509 at age 17, hopes were high that he would be a brilliant and benevolent ruler. And for a time, he was. In the early years of his reign, Henry won widespread praise for his generosity, charm, and military victories against France. He and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, were a glamorous and popular couple, presiding over a lively court filled with masques, feasts, and tournaments. But behind the scenes, trouble was brewing. After nearly 20 years of marriage, Henry had become increasingly desperate for a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. Catherine had borne him a daughter, Mary, but the baby boy she conceived never survived. Henry became convinced that God was punishing him for marrying Catherine, who had briefly been married to his late brother. When the Pope refused to annul the marriage, Henry took matters into his own hands. In a shocking move that reverberated across Europe, he broke with the Catholic Church, declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and married Anne Boleyn, one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting. The English Reformation had begun, launching a tumultuous period of religious and political upheaval. Henry dissolved the monasteries, seizing their wealth and property for the crown. He ordered English translations of the Bible to be placed in every church, and he brutally suppressed any opposition to his new role as spiritual and temporal leader of England. But even Anne Boleyn could not give Henry the son he so desperately desired. After just 3 years of marriage, Henry had her investigated for treason, adultery, and even incest. In a trial that shocked the nation, Anne was found guilty on all counts, despite a lack of credible evidence. On May 19th, 1536, she was beheaded on the grounds of the Tower of London, becoming the first English queen to be publicly executed. Henry would go on to marry 4 more times, with each wife suffering her own tragic fate. His third wife, Jane Seymour, finally bore him the longed-for male heir, Prince Edward, but died just days after childbirth. Anne of Cleves was rejected for her looks and quickly discarded. Young Catherine Howard was beheaded for adultery, although she was likely the victim of sexual abuse. and Catherine Parr narrowly escaped a plot against her for her Protestant sympathies. Through it all, Henry continued his harsh persecution of both Protestants and Catholics who refused to submit to his authority. Scores were executed for heresy, including his longtime friend and advisor, Thomas More. The dissolution of the monasteries led to widespread poverty and unrest, and Henry's lavish spending and costly foreign wars drained the royal treasury, forcing him to debase the currency. By the time Henry VIII died in 1547, he had transformed England forever. The Protestant Reformation was firmly entrenched, even if his young son Edward VI would take it in an even more radically Protestant direction. The monarchy had assumed unprecedented power over religious and political life, and the excesses and instability of Henry's reign foreshadowed the struggles that would eventually lead to the English Civil War. Today, Henry VIII is remembered as one of the most consequential and controversial kings in English history, a man of great appetites and ambition, who let nothing stand in the way of his desire for power, pleasure, and progeny. His legacy endures in the Anglican Church, the splendor of his many palaces, and the lurid tales of his 6 marriages that have captured the popular imagination for centuries. As we reflect on the tumultuous lives and shocking deeds of medieval kings like Henry VIII, it's hard not to be struck by the strange mix of brutality and brilliance that characterized so many of their reigns. On the one hand, these men wielded enormous power and prestige, shaping the course of history through their policies, conquests, and patronage of the arts and sciences. But on the other hand, they were often driven by their own unchecked desires and delusions, leaving a trail of bloodshed, scandal, and tyranny in their wake. Perhaps more than anything, the stories of these controversial kings remind us of the age-old adage that absolute power corrupts absolutely. In an era when monarchs were answerable to no one but God, the temptation to abuse that power was ever present. And yet, even in their worst excesses, these kings also embodied the vibrant, colourful, and often bizarre spirit of the Middle Ages, a time when life was often nasty, brutish, and short, but never dull. As we've seen throughout this journey into the lives of the most controversial kings of the medieval world, these were men who loomed larger than life, casting long shadows over their own times and far beyond. From the alleged homosexuality of William Rufus to the murderous cruelty of Pedro the Cruel, from the religious fanaticism of Philip IV to the madness of Eric XIV, each of these kings left an indelible mark on the history and culture of Europe. Their stories are by turns tragic, farcical, shocking, and strangely relatable, offering a window into a world that can seem at once utterly alien and surprisingly familiar. For all their flaws and foibles, these kings were still human beings, grappling with the same fundamental questions of power, love, faith, and mortality that have haunted humanity since the dawn of time. Perhaps that is why their stories continue to fascinate us to this day, providing endless fodder for books, films, plays, and television shows. In a world that can often seem hopelessly complex and impersonal, there is something oddly comforting about looking back on a time when the fate of nations could turn on the whims of a single, fallible individual. And so, as we come to the end of our journey through the lives of the most controversial kings of the Middle Ages, let us take a moment to marvel at the sheer scope and strangeness of the human experience. For all the progress we have made since those distant days, we are still the same species that produce both the soaring cathedrals of Chartres and the bloody fields of Agincourt, the sublime poetry of Dante, and the diabolical tortures of the Inquisition. In the end, perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Middle Ages is simply this, that even in the darkest and most turbulent of times, the human spirit remains an indomitable force, capable of both breathtaking beauty and unfathomable cruelty. And as we drift off to sleep, let us dream of a world in which the better angels of our nature may yet prevail, guiding us toward a future of greater wisdom, compassion, and peace. Good night and sweet dreams. Philip IV's ruthlessness extended beyond the Knights Templar to his own subjects. In 1306, he abruptly expelled all Jews from France, giving them mere months to flee and seizing their property and assets left behind. This devastating decree uprooted thousands who had called France home for generations. Many Jewish families were forced to sell their belongings for a pittance before fleeing to surrounding nations. The lucky ones found refuge in regions like Provence and Roussillon, which were not yet under direct French rule. But for the rest, the expulsion meant leaving behind everything they knew and starting over in foreign lands. The official justification for the expulsion was that the Jews were guilty of usury, or lending money at high interest rates. However, this was a common anti-Semitic trope in medieval Europe, and the real motivations were likely far more cynical. By seizing Jewish property and wealth, Philip could line his own coffers and curry favor with the nobility and rising merchant class. The expulsion of the Jews was a demonstration of Philip's willingness to target vulnerable groups for his own gain. It was part of a larger pattern of persecution and scapegoating that would come to define his reign. From the Knights Templar to religious minorities, no one was safe from the French king's avarice and intolerance. The impact of the expulsion was devastating for French Jews. Some historians estimate that over 100,000 were forced to flee, though the true number is difficult to determine. Many faced violence, theft, and extortion as they made their way out of the country. Families were separated, communities broken apart, and centuries of Jewish history and culture were lost. The expulsion also had economic repercussions for France itself. Jews had played a significant role in banking, trade, and skilled crafts. Their abrupt departure disrupted commercial activities and left many nobles and merchants scrambling to fill the gaps. Some historians argue that this contributed to the economic instability that would plague France in the coming decades. Philip IV's reign was marked by a ruthless consolidation of power and suppression of perceived threats to his authority. From the disbandment of the Knights Templar to the expulsion of the Jews, he left a legacy of persecution and intolerance. His actions would have far-reaching consequences, not only for the groups he targeted, but for the very stability of France itself. As we move on to our next controversial king, Pedro I of Castile, we see a similar pattern of brutality and tyranny. Pedro, known as the Cruel, lived up to his nickname through a reign marked by violence, paranoia, and political turmoil. Born in 1334, Pedro was the son of Alfonso XI of Castile and Maria of Portugal. He ascended to the throne at the age of 15, after the death of his father from the Black Death. From the beginning, Pedro's reign was marred by conflict and instability. One of the defining features of Pedro's rule was his brutality towards his own family members. In 1358, he had his half-brother, Alfonso, murdered in a fit of paranoia. Alfonso had been a potential rival for the throne, and Pedro saw him as a threat to be eliminated. The murder shocked the Castilian court and earned Pedro a reputation for ruthlessness. But Alfonso was not the only family member to face Pedro's wrath. The king also turned against his own wife, Blanche of Bourbon. The marriage had been arranged for political reasons, but Pedro quickly abandoned Blanche in favor of his mistress, Maria de Padilla. He had Blanche imprisoned and eventually killed, an act that scandalized medieval Europe. Pedro's cruelty extended beyond his own family to his subjects as well. He was known for his harsh justice and use of torture against those he perceived as enemies. In one notorious incident, he had a rabbi skinned alive for allegedly speaking out against him. Such acts of brutality were designed to instill fear and obedience in his people. Politically, Pedro's reign was marked by constant warfare and shifting alliances. He allied with England in the early stages of the 100 Years' War, seeing an opportunity to gain territory in France. However, This alliance proved disastrous when the English were defeated at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. Pedro also faced opposition from within his own kingdom. Many nobles resented his centralization of power and erosion of their traditional privileges. In 1366, a group of rebels led by Pedro's half-brother Henry of Trastamara launched a civil war to overthrow him. The conflict would drag on for years, with Pedro eventually seeking aid from England once again. In a twist of fate, it was Henry who would ultimately emerge victorious. In 1369, with the backing of the French, he defeated Pedro's forces and claimed the Castilian throne for himself. Pedro was forced to flee, seeking refuge with his ally, the Black Prince of England. But even in exile, Pedro could not escape his violent end. In 1369, he was lured to a meeting with Henry under the guise of reconciliation. There, in the castle of Montiel, he was stabbed to death by his half-brother, ending his bloody and tumultuous reign. The lurid details of Pedro's assassination only added to his notorious reputation. According to some accounts, he was found in his bedchamber with his mistress when Henry's men burst in. The two half-brothers grappled on the floor before Henry delivered the fatal blow, stabbing Pedro multiple times. Pedro's death marked the end of a reign defined by cruelty, paranoia, and political instability. His legacy would be one of a tyrant who brutalized his own family and subjects in a ruthless quest for power. The civil war that ended his rule left Castile weakened and divided, setting the stage for further conflicts in the years to come. As we reflect on the reigns of kings like Philip IV and Pedro I, we see the dark side of medieval monarchy laid bare. These were rulers who wielded immense power with few checks or balances, able to inflict suffering and terror on a whim. Their stories serve as cautionary tales about the dangers of unchecked authority and the human capacity for cruelty. But even as we recoil at their actions, we must also remember the larger historical context in which they lived. The medieval world was one of constant warfare, religious strife, and political upheaval. Kings like Philip and Pedro were products of their time, shaped by the brutal realities of their era. In the end, perhaps the most enduring legacy of these controversial kings is the lessons they offer us about the nature of power itself. They remind us that even the most absolute authority can be fleeting, and that those who abuse their power often sow the seeds of their own downfall. As we continue to grapple with questions of leadership and governance in our own time, the stories of these medieval rulers continue to resonate, offering both warning and insight into the complexities of the human condition. Our journey through the annals of controversial kings now takes us to the tumultuous realm of 16th century Sweden and the enigmatic figure of Erik XIV. Born in 1533, Erik was the eldest son of Gustav I, the king who had established the Vasa dynasty and broken Sweden's ties with the Catholic Church. From an early age, Erik was groomed for leadership, receiving a humanist education and exposure to the arts of governance. He was known for his intelligence and cultural refinement, with a particular passion for music and architecture. But beneath this cultured exterior lay a complex and troubled psyche. As he ascended to the throne in 1560, Erik brought a mix of progressive ideas and personal instability to his reign. He sought to modernize Sweden's economy and military, investing in new technologies like the musket, and promoting trade with England and the Dutch Republic. He also pursued an ambitious foreign policy, seeking to expand Swedish influence in the Baltic region. But even as he implemented these forward-thinking policies, Erik's rule was plagued by his own paranoia and delusions. He became increasingly convinced that he was surrounded by conspirators and enemies, seeing threats in even his closest advisors and family members. One of the most bizarre episodes of Erik's reign was his elaborate courtship of Elizabeth I of England. The Swedish king became fixated on the idea of marrying the Virgin Queen, seeing it as a way to secure a powerful ally and boost his own prestige. He bombarded Elizabeth with letters and gifts, even commissioning a lavish portrait of himself to send to her court. But Elizabeth, ever the shrewd political operator, kept Eric at arm's length. She entertained his overtures, but never committed to a marriage, using the prospect as a bargaining chip in her diplomatic maneuverings. For Eric, the rejection was a bitter blow to his ego and a source of deep embarrassment. As his reign wore on, Eric's behavior grew increasingly erratic and violent. He became prone to fits of rage and paranoia, lashing out at those around him. In 1567, he ordered the imprisonment and execution of several members of the powerful Stuart family, whom he accused of plotting against him. The Stuart murders, as they came to be known, shocked the Swedish nobility and fueled a growing opposition to Eric's rule. Many saw the king as a dangerous and unstable tyrant, unfit to lead the nation. In 1568, a group of nobles led by Eric's own brother John staged a coup and removed him from the throne. Eric's fall from power was as dramatic as his reign itself. He was imprisoned in a series of castles, moved from one location to another as his captors feared he might escape or inspire a revolt. In his confinement, he descended further into madness, plagued by hallucinations and delusions of grandeur. In 1577, after 9 years in captivity, Eric died in the castle of Urbyhus. The official cause of death was listed as dysentery, but rumours swirled that he had been poisoned on the orders of his brother, now King John III. The true circumstances of his demise remain a mystery to this day. Eric XIV's reign was a study in contrasts, a forward-thinking monarch undone by his own paranoia and instability. His story reminds us of the precariousness of power in the medieval world, where even the most promising rulers could fall victim to their own demons and the machinations of their rivals. As we reflect on Eric's tragic tale, we are reminded of the heavy burden of leadership in any era. The pressures of power can warp even the most brilliant minds, turning visionaries into tyrants and reformers into madmen. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the fragility of the human psyche. But even in his downfall, Eric XIV remains a fascinating figure, a man ahead of his time in many ways, yet ultimately consumed by his own flaws and fears. His legacy is one of both promise and tragedy, a reminder of the complexities and contradictions that define the human experience. From the icy forests of Sweden, our journey through the annals of controversial kings now takes us to the foggy shores of medieval England and the infamous reign of John, known to history as Lackland. Born in 1166, John was the youngest son of King Henry II, a man whose own legacy was marred by scandal and family strife. Unlike his older brothers, John was not originally groomed for kingship. His nickname, Lackland, referred to his lack of inheritance, as his father had already divided his territories among his elder sons. But fate would intervene in John's favour, or perhaps, as some would argue, to England's great misfortune. John's path to the throne was paved with tragedy and treachery. His older brother, Richard the Lionheart, died without an heir in 1999, leaving John as the next in line. But many of the English nobles preferred John's nephew, Arthur of Brittany, seeing him as a more legitimate claimant. The ensuing power struggle would come to define John's early reign. In 1203, Arthur was captured by John's forces and mysteriously disappeared soon after, with rumours swirling that John had ordered his murder. The incident cast a pall over John's rule from the very beginning, earning him a reputation for ruthlessness and treachery. As king, John faced a host of challenges and controversies. He clashed repeatedly with the English barons, who resented his heavy-handed rule and attempts to curtail their traditional privileges. He also feuded with the powerful Pope Innocent III, who sought to assert the Church's authority over the English crown. The defining moment of John's reign came in 1215, when a group of rebel barons forced him to sign the Magna Carta, a document that would become a cornerstone of English law and a symbol of the limits on royal power. The Charter guaranteed certain rights and freedoms to the nobility and the church, and established the principle that even the king was subject to the rule of law. But John had no intention of abiding by the Magna Carta's terms. He immediately appealed to the Pope to annul the document, setting off a renewed round of conflict with the barons. The years that followed were marked by civil war and political turmoil, as John sought to reassert his authority and crush his opponents. On the military front, John suffered a series of humiliating defeats. He lost a major campaign in France, ceding the region of Normandy to the French crown. The defeat was a blow to both John's prestige and England's coffers, as Normandy had been a major source of revenue for the English monarchy. John's reign was also marred by personal scandal and tragedy. In 1216, his beloved son and heir, Henry, died suddenly at the age of 9. John himself would follow just a year later, succumbing to dysentery while on campaign against the rebel barons. In the centuries that followed, John's reputation would only sink further. He was remembered as a cruel and petty tyrant, a man who had squandered England's wealth and prestige through his own incompetence and vanity. The legendary tale of his losing the crown jewels in a swamp only added to his image as a hapless and foolish ruler. But for all his flaws and failures, John's reign also marked a turning point in English history. The Magna Carta, though initially a dead letter, would go on to inspire generations of reformers and revolutionaries, becoming a symbol of the fight against tyranny and oppression. In a sense, John's legacy is one of unintended consequences. His misrule and abuses of power helped to galvanize opposition to the monarchy and spur the development of English common law and parliamentary government. Without John, there might have been no Magna Carta, no Bill of Rights, no tradition of limited government and individual liberty. Of course, none of this was John's intention. He remained to the end a man consumed by his own greed and insecurity, a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked power. But in the long arc of history, even the most flawed and controversial figures can play a role in shaping the course of events. As we ponder John's legacy, we are reminded of the complex and often contradictory nature of human history. The same figures who cause great harm and suffering can also, through their very failures, help to spur progress and change. It is a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of the past, there are glimmers of hope and possibility. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the lives of some of the most controversial kings in medieval history. From the icy north of Sweden to the sun-drenched plains of Castile, from the intrigue-filled courts of France to the blood-soaked battlefields of England, we have seen the many faces of power and ambition, cruelty and madness. These kings were men of their time, shaped by the harsh realities of the medieval world. They lived in an age of constant warfare and religious strife, of plagues and famines and social upheaval. In such a world, power was often wielded with a heavy hand, and the line between greatness and infamy was razor thin. But even as we recoil at the abuses and excesses of these rulers, we must also seek to understand them in their historical context. They were products of a society that valued strength and ruthlessness, that saw the monarch as the embodiment of divine right and absolute authority. In their own ways, each of these kings left a mark on history. Some, like Eric XIV and John Lackland, are remembered primarily for their failures and misdeeds. Others, like Philip IV and Henry VIII, are more complex figures, men who combined great vision with great cruelty, who reshaped their kingdoms even as they unleashed chaos and suffering. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of these controversial reigns is the danger of unchecked power. When kings are able to rule with impunity, when there are no constraints on their authority or their appetites, the results are often disastrous. We see this in the paranoid purges of Eric XIV, the ruthless persecutions of Philip IV, the bloody tyranny of Pedro the Cruel. But we also see glimmers of hope and progress, even in the midst of these dark chapters. The Magna Carta, born of John's misrule, would go on to inspire generations of reformers and revolutionaries. The Protestant Reformation, sparked in part by Henry VIII's break with Rome, would reshape the religious and political landscape of Europe. In the end, the legacy of these controversial kings is a reminder of the enduring human struggle for justice, for freedom, for a society in which power is not concentrated in the hands of a few, but shared among the many. It is a struggle that continues to this day in nations and communities around the world. As we reflect on these stories of power and ambition, tyranny and resistance, we are reminded of the words of the great medieval poet Dante Alighieri. The hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in times of great moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. These kings, for all their flaws and failings, were not neutral figures. They shaped the course of history, for good and for ill. They remind us of the heavy burden of leadership, the temptations and perils of power, the fragility of even the mightiest thrones. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us ponder the lessons of these controversial reigns. Let us seek. Of course, not all kings in the Middle Ages were quite so controversial or despised. Take, for example, Louis IX of France, better known as Saint Louis. He was a pious and just ruler, renowned for his fairness, integrity, and devotion to the Catholic Church. During his reign in the 13th century, Louis IX went to great lengths to root out corruption and deliver righteous verdicts in court cases. He was known to sit under an oak tree to hear the complaints of his subjects directly, making himself accessible to the common people in an unprecedented way for a monarch. Louis IX also had a reputation as a peacemaker, working to resolve conflicts with other rulers through diplomacy rather than warfare whenever possible. He even voluntarily returned some conquered territories to England's Henry III as a gesture of goodwill and fairness. However, Louis IX's deep religiosity also drove him to take a hard line against Jews and heretics in his kingdom. He ordered the burning of Jewish texts, required Jews to wear identifying badges, and supported the Inquisition in France. But perhaps Louis IX is best remembered for leading the 7th and 8th Crusades to the Holy Land. Seen as the ideal Christian king, Louis was deeply committed to the crusading movement. After vowing to go on crusade if he recovered from a serious illness, Louis set out for Egypt in 1248 to strike at the heart of Muslim power. However, his military campaign was a disaster. Louis was defeated in battle, captured, and had to be ransomed for a huge sum. Undeterred, he attempted another crusade in 1270, this time targeting Tunis. But the expedition was again a failure, and Louis himself died of dysentery in the sweltering North African heat. Despite the disastrous outcome of his crusades, Louis IX was revered for his piety and selfless devotion to what he saw as a holy cause. He fasted, prayed intensely, and performed acts of charity and humility, such as washing the feet of the poor. Chroniclers marveled at his religiosity and uprightness, which stood in stark contrast to many of his less scrupulous royal contemporaries. Louis IX was canonized as a saint in 1297 by Pope Boniface VIII, cementing his legacy as the ideal Christian monarch. The cult of St. Louis flourished in the centuries that followed, with his reign seen as a golden age of justice, chivalry, and righteousness. But in many ways, Louis IX was an outlier among medieval monarchs, the exception that proved the rule. Most kings were concerned with more earthly matters, like expanding their power, eliminating rivals, and enriching themselves and their favorites. Indeed, the reigns of controversial kings, like those we've explored in this program, were in many ways closer to the norm in the Middle Ages. The medieval period, was a time of immense instability and shifting power dynamics when kings ruled absolutely and often violently. In a world without democracy or constitutional rights, the whims and appetites of individual monarchs could mean the difference between prosperity and ruin, peace and bloodshed. Without the constraints of modern political systems, medieval kings were free to engage in all manner of shocking and outrageous behaviour. They waged endless wars against their neighbours, brutally persecuted religious minorities, and imposed backbreaking taxation on their subjects. They plotted against and even murdered their own family members in struggles for power. They abandoned their spouses for lovers, broke sacred oaths, and defied the authority of the church. In short, they were free to act on their basest impulses and darkest desires. Of course, this is not to say that all medieval monarchs were bloodthirsty tyrants or debauched libertines. History has judged some, like Louis IX, to be saintly and just rulers, and even the most controversial kings had their moments of mercy and goodwill. But what's undeniable is that the medieval period was a time of extremes, when the unchecked power of kings led to some of the most shocking and dramatic episodes in European history. In a world so radically different from our own, it can be hard to understand the mindset and motivations of medieval monarchs. They lived in a time of constant warfare, religious fervour, and superstition, when life was often brutish and short. In such an unforgiving milieu, perhaps it's no wonder that so many kings resorted to ruthlessness and depravity to survive and succeed. Regardless, the complex personalities and scandalous deeds of the most controversial kings continue to captivate us centuries later. Their lives are like something out of Game of Thrones or The Lord of the Rings, full of bloody intrigue, shocking twists, and larger-than-life characters. But the most astonishing thing of all is that their stories are real, preserved in the pages of history for us to marvel at today. So while we may recoil at their cruelty and shake our heads at their excesses, there's no denying that medieval kings like William II, Philip IV, Pedro the Cruel, and the others we've met in this program led extraordinary lives in extraordinary times. They may not have been good, but they were undeniably fascinating. The kind of figures that populate our most lurid fantasies and memorable nightmares. And really, what more can you ask for when drifting off to sleep? So let the Machiavellian plots and battlefield bloodshed fade into the background as you slip into slumber. Rest easy knowing that, whatever your worries, you will likely never have to depose a deranged monarch or evade a murderous usurper. For all their flaws, we must admit that the scandalous kings of the Middle Ages make our modern lives seem wonderfully dull in comparison. As your eyes grow heavy, take a moment to appreciate the comfortable banality of the 21st century. Then, let the riotous pageant of the medieval past carry you off to strange and thrilling dreams of castle intrigues and unholy crusades. The controversial kings beckon from the distant reaches of history, inviting you to marvel at their audacious lives as you slip into the welcoming embrace of sleep. Good night, dear listener, and don't let the Plantagenets bite. And so, as we've seen, the reigns of these controversial kings were marked by scandal, brutality, and the relentless pursuit of power at any cost. From William II's rumoured homosexuality and contentious relationship with the Church, to Philip IV's ruthless suppression of the Knights Templar and expulsion of the Jews from France, these monarchs left an indelible mark on the medieval world. Pedro I of Castile, known as Pedro the Cruel, lived up to his moniker with a reign characterized by murder, abandonment, and a dramatic assassination in his own bedchamber. Eric XIV of Sweden, despite his progressive policies, descended into paranoia and delusion, ultimately meeting his end at the hands of his own brother. John of England, the infamous John Lackland, found himself at odds with his own nobility, resulting in the groundbreaking Magna Carta that would forever limit the power of the monarchy. and Henry VIII, perhaps the most famous of all, forever changed the course of English history with his unprecedented split from the Catholic Church and his 6 tumultuous marriages. These kings, for all their faults and controversies, remain endlessly fascinating figures. Their stories are testament to the incredible power and equally incredible corruption that characterized the medieval era. Their legacies continue to resonate to this day, shaping our understanding of politics, religion, and the very nature of power itself. As we come to the end of our journey through the lives of these controversial kings, it's worth reflecting on what their stories can teach us. In many ways, they serve as cautionary tales, reminding us of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of holding our leaders accountable. At the same time, they offer a glimpse into a world so different from our own, a world where the whims of a single individual could change the course of history. It's a world that can seem almost unbelievable at times, with its tales of murder, betrayal, and larger-than-life personalities. But it's a world that continues to capture our imaginations, centuries after these kings lived and died. Their stories, for all their scandal and controversy, remain as compelling today as they were in their own time. As we drift off to sleep, let us carry with us a newfound appreciation for the rich tapestry of history, woven through with the lives of these extraordinary individuals. Let us remember that even in the darkest of times, there are lessons to be learned and stories to be told. And so, as the curtain falls on our exploration of the most controversial kings in medieval history, I invite you to continue your journey through the fascinating world of the past. If you've enjoyed this video, I encourage you to like and subscribe to never miss an episode. There are so many more stories waiting to be told, so many more characters waiting to be discovered. Until next time, sweet dreams.